The whisper came sharp as winter glass against my kitchen window. "Don't tell the neighbors." My son's voice, low and urgent, sliced through the warm air where I'd been kneading tomorrow's bread. His words hung between us like smoke, and I felt something inside me go still, not the good kind of still, but the hollow quiet that comes when dignity gets asked to step aside. I stood there, flour dusting my knuckles, watching his face through the rain-streaked pane. He pressed closer to the glass, his breath fogging the corner where the seal had loosened last spring. "Mom, I'm serious. This stays between us." The oven timer chose that moment to pierce the silence, its shrill cry announcing that something was burning. But I couldn't move. Not yet. Because in that whisper, in the way he glanced toward Mrs. Rodriguez's porch light next door, I heard something that made my chest tighten. He was asking me to disappear. Not my body, that he still needed for Sunday dinners and emergency babysitting. But my voice, my version of what had happened between us, and my right to speak my own truth in my own neighborhood. The bread in the oven began to smell of char and disappointment, but I stayed frozen at that window, understanding with sudden clarity that silence can be another form of theft. The rain picked up, drumming against the roof with the persistence of an old argument. My son stepped back from the window, satisfied that his message had landed. He pulled his coat tighter and jogged toward his car, leaving me alone with the burning bread and the weight of what he'd just asked me to carry. I finally moved then, rushing to pull the loaves from the oven, too late, their crusts blackened beyond saving. As I set them on the cooling rack, I realized I was trembling. Not from fear, but from something sharper. Something that felt like the first spark of a fire I'd been too polite to light. 3 weeks. That's all it took to change everything. 3 weeks from that whispered command to the morning I would stand in my garden, soil under my fingernails, planting marigolds in my own name. 3 weeks to discover that the woman who had spent decades shrinking herself small enough to fit other people's comfort could expand again, could fill her own space with the quiet authority of someone who had stopped asking permission to exist. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what those 3 weeks held: the sound of new locks clicking into place under lamplight, the weight of keys in my pocket that opened only to my choosing, and the steam rising from tea shared with neighbors who had been waiting years for me to trust them with the truth. I was not waiting for permission. Not anymore. The rain that had witnessed my son's whisper would return twice more before this story found its ending, once to wash the driveway clean during our final confrontation, and once to bless the marigolds I planted in defiance of every small silence I'd ever swallowed. But first, I had to remember how I'd learned to make myself so small in the first place. The kitchen table where I'd kneaded that burning bread had seen 23 years of Sunday dinners, each one a masterclass in the art of diminishment. I can still feel the grain of that old oak under my palms and still smell the lingering ghost of pot roast and disappointment that seemed to season every gathering. It was at that table, 3 months before the whisper, that I finally understood how thoroughly I'd been erased. "Mom's getting confused again," my daughter-in-law had announced to the assembled family, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who'd appointed herself keeper of other people's competence. I'd been telling a story about my neighbor's new garden, something light and harmless, when she cut me off mid-sentence. She told me the same story yesterday, but with completely different details. The conversation moved on without me, flowing around my presence like water around a stone. My son nodded along, adding his own observations about my supposed decline. "She left the stove on last week," he said, though we both knew it had been the oven timer I'd forgotten to set, not a burner left burning. "And she's been asking the same questions about her bank statements." I sat there, chipped teacup growing cold in my hands, watching my family discuss my mental state as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be heard. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were questioning my memory while rewriting my experiences in real time, editing my stories to fit their narrative of gentle decline. That night, after they'd gone home with their leftover pot roast and their satisfied certainty about my diminishing capacity, I sat at that same table with a yellow legal pad and began to write. At the top of the page, I printed in careful letters, "Things I no longer owe." The list started small. I no longer owed explanations for my grocery choices, apologies for my opinions, or gratitude for being tolerated in my own home. But as the pen moved across the paper, the list grew longer, bolder, and more honest. I no longer owed anyone the performance of confusion to make their control feel necessary. I no longer owed my silence to preserve their comfort. I no longer owed my diminishment to feed their sense of importance. The words flowed like water through a broken dam, and with each line, I felt something straightening in my spine, some long-bent thing finally allowed to stand upright. By the time I finished writing, the kitchen had grown dark around me, and I could hear the house settling into its nighttime rhythms. But I wasn't tired. For the first time in months, I felt awake, truly awake, as if I'd been sleepwalking through my own life and had finally opened my eyes. I folded the list carefully and slipped it into the drawer where I kept my important papers, next to the deed to the house and the insurance policies. It belonged there, I realized. It was just as vital as any legal document, this declaration of what I would no longer give away. Respect is not a hand-me-down. It's not something that gets passed down from generation to generation, growing threadbare with use. It's something that must be claimed fresh each day, worn with the confidence of someone who knows their own worth. That night, sitting in my dark kitchen with my list of refusals, I began to remember what it felt like to wear my own respect like a coat that actually fit. The next morning brought the kind of clarity that only comes after a long fever breaks. I woke with my list still fresh in my mind and a strange new energy humming in my chest. The yellow legal pad had been just the beginning, now I needed to turn those words into action, those refusals into boundaries that couldn't be crossed without my permission. I started small, the way you start any revolution, with the things that seem too minor to matter until you realize they're the foundation everything else is built on. I made coffee in my good china instead of the chipped mug I'd been using for years, telling myself it was too nice for every day. I called the bank and asked for copies of all my statements from the past year, not because I was confused about them, but because I wanted to see my financial life laid out clearly, without anyone else's interpretation clouding the numbers. The young teller who helped me was patient and thorough, walking me through each statement with the kind of respect I'd forgotten I deserved. "These are all in perfect order, Mrs. Chen," she said, using my name instead of the generic dear or honey I'd grown accustomed to hearing. "Your accounts are very well managed." I thanked her and slipped the statements into a manila envelope, feeling the weight of my own competence in my hands. That afternoon, I drove to the hardware store and bought a new deadbolt for my front door. The clerk, a woman about my daughter-in-law's age, didn't question my purchase or suggest I might need help installing it. She simply rang up the sale and wished me a good day, treating me like any other customer capable of making their own decisions. I carried that small dignity with me as I drove home, the lock rattling softly in its box on the passenger seat. The installation would have to wait until evening. I wasn't ready for the questions that would come if my son happened to drive by and see me changing locks in broad daylight. But the weight of the keys in my pocket felt like a promise, a tangible reminder that some doors could be opened and closed by my choice alone. A boundary is just a door you keep closed, I thought, and for the first time in years, I was the one holding the key. That evening, as the sun settled behind the maple tree in my backyard, I spread the lock's components across my kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle I was finally ready to solve. The instructions were clear, the tools simple enough that my hands remembered their purpose despite months of being told they were too shaky for such tasks. I worked slowly, methodically, savoring the quiet satisfaction of metal fitting into metal, of screws turning true in their holes. The hardest part wasn't the installation itself, but the moment when I had to remove the old lock, the one my son had a key to, the one that had made my home feel less like a sanctuary and more like a way station for other people's convenience. As I unscrewed the final bolt, I felt a flutter of something that might have been fear or might have been excitement. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. The new lock slid into place with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for this moment as long as I had. I tested the mechanism once, twice, 3 times, feeling the smooth resistance of tumblers aligning and the satisfying weight of security clicking into place. The sound was crisp and final, not harsh, but definitive. The click was louder than any argument I'd ever had, more decisive than any conversation about my competence or confusion. I stood on my front porch in the lamplight, testing my new keys, watching the way the metal caught the yellow glow. The night air was cool against my face, carrying the scent of Mrs. Rodriguez's jasmine and the distant sound of teenagers laughing somewhere down the block. My neighborhood looked the same as it had that morning, but something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer a guest in my own life, no longer waiting for permission to feel safe in my own home. When I finally went inside and locked the door behind me, my door, with my lock, opened and closed by my choice, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't realized had been holding its breath for months. I made myself a cup of tea in my good china and sat at my kitchen table, looking out at the street where I'd lived for 37 years. Tomorrow, I decided, I would begin the harder work of changing the locks on my voice. The change was subtle at first, the way spring arrives, not all at once, but in small accumulations of warmth and light that suddenly add up to something undeniable. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed it first, commenting over the fence that my porch light had been burning steadier lately and that my voice carried differently when I called good morning across our adjoining yards. "You seem more present," she said one afternoon as we both tended our front gardens, her words careful but kind. "More like yourself, if that makes sense." She was deadheading her roses, her movements efficient and practiced, and I found myself watching the way she worked, confident, unhurried, and completely absorbed in the task at hand. When had I stopped moving through the world with that kind of certainty? "I've been making some changes," I told her, surprised by how easily the words came. For months, I'd been so careful with my speech, second-guessing every story, every opinion, every casual observation. But standing there in my garden with soil under my fingernails and the afternoon sun warm on my shoulders, I felt my voice settling back into its natural rhythm. Mrs. Rodriguez straightened, wiping her hands on her gardening apron. "Good changes, I hope?" There was something in her tone that suggested she'd been waiting for this conversation, that she'd noticed more than just my porch light and my morning greetings. I found myself telling her about the lock, about the list I'd written, and about the way my family had been discussing my competence as if I weren't sitting right there at my own kitchen table. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like water finding its way around a dam that had finally started to crack. Mrs. Rodriguez listened without interrupting, her dark eyes steady and kind, occasionally nodding in recognition. "My daughter tried something similar," she said when I finished. "Kept insisting I was too old to live alone, too confused to manage my own affairs. She had my best interests at heart," she said. Mrs. Rodriguez's laugh was dry but not bitter. "Funny how other people's best interests for us always seem to involve us having less say in our own lives." We stood there in comfortable silence, two women who had learned the particular exhaustion of being managed by people who loved us. The afternoon light slanted through the maple leaves, casting shifting patterns on the ground between us, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the simple pleasure of being understood without having to explain myself. "Would you like to come in for tea?" I asked, the invitation surprising us both. I hadn't had a friend over for tea in so long I'd almost forgotten I was allowed to issue such invitations. "I have some of that jasmine blend you mentioned liking." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled, the kind of smile that reaches all the way to the eyes. "I'd love that. Let me just put these tools away." 20 minutes later, we sat at my kitchen table with steam rising from our cups, the late afternoon light golden and forgiving through my clean windows. I told her about my son's whispered command, about the way he'd pressed his face to the glass and demanded my silence. Mrs. Rodriguez listened, occasionally sipping her tea, her presence steady and undemanding. "And what did you tell him?" she asked when I finished. "Nothing, yet," I admitted. "But I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to tell anyone else who asks." "Because of the thing he doesn't want the neighbors to know?" "It's not shameful. It's just true." I took a breath, feeling the words gather weight in my chest. He's been trying to convince me I'm incompetent so he can take over my finances. And I've been letting him, because it was easier than fighting, easier than disappointing him. The words hung in the air between us, simple and clean as truth often is once you stop dressing it up in excuses and explanations. Mrs. Rodriguez reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, her skin warm and slightly rough from years of gardening. Truth spoken gently can still carry weight, she said. Sometimes it carries more weight because it's gentle. Because it doesn't need to shout to be heard. We finished our tea as the sun set behind my maple tree, talking about gardens and grandchildren and the particular courage it takes to reclaim your own voice after years of letting others speak for you. When Mrs. Rodriguez finally gathered her sweater and prepared to leave, she paused at my front door, her hand on the new lock I'd installed. "This suits you," she said, running her fingers over the brushed metal. "It looks like it belongs here." After she left, I stood in my kitchen washing our teacups, watching the last light fade from the sky. The house felt different, not empty, but peacefully quiet, like a space that had remembered its own purpose. I dried the cups carefully and put them back in the cabinet, already looking forward to the next time I'd have reason to take them down. The confrontation came 3 days later, arriving with the kind of sudden violence that spring storms bring to quiet neighborhoods. I was watering my front garden when my son's car pulled into the driveway, followed closely by my daughter-in-law's sedan. They emerged from their vehicles with the synchronized purpose of people who had planned this moment, rehearsed their approach, and decided it was time to address my recent behavior. The rain had started that morning as a gentle mist, but by the time they reached my front porch, it was falling in earnest, drumming against the roof and turning the driveway into a mirror of gray sky. I set down my watering can and straightened, feeling the weight of my house keys in my pocket, the solid presence of my new lock at my back. "Mom, we need to talk," my son said, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had appointed himself the reasonable one in an unreasonable situation. He was wearing his good coat, the navy wool one he saved for important occasions, and I realized this visit had been planned as carefully as a business meeting. "Of course," I said, gesturing toward the porch. "Would you like to come in? I can make coffee." "Actually, we'd prefer to talk out here," my daughter-in-law said, her tone suggesting that my offer of hospitality was somehow inappropriate. "This won't take long." So we stood there in the rain, 3 adults having a conversation that should have happened around my kitchen table, with coffee and the basic dignity of shelter. But I understood the staging. They wanted me to feel exposed, off balance, and grateful when they finally allowed me back into my own home. "Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned you've been telling her some concerning things," my son began, his words careful and measured. "Stories about our family that aren't quite accurate." I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the rain. "What stories would those be?" "About us trying to control your finances," my daughter-in-law said, her voice sharp with the kind of impatience that comes when someone refuses to accept the role you've written for them. "About us questioning your competence." "Mrs. Rodriguez is worried about you, Mom. She thinks you might be getting confused about what's really happening." The rain picked up, soaking through my gardening clothes, but I didn't move toward the shelter of my porch. Something in their certainty, in the way they'd turned my neighbor's kindness into evidence of my decline, made me want to stand exactly where I was, rooted like the marigolds I'd been watering. "What's really happening," I said, my voice steady despite the rain running down my face, "is that you've been managing my life without my permission. What's really happening is that you discuss my mental state at family dinners as if I'm not sitting right there. What's really happening is that you asked me not to tell the neighbors about our disagreement because you know how it would sound to people who aren't invested in believing I'm incompetent." My son's face flushed, and he stepped closer, his voice dropping to that same urgent whisper he'd used at my kitchen window. "You're embarrassing yourself, Mom. And you're embarrassing us. Mrs. Rodriguez doesn't need to hear about our private family business." "Our private family business," I repeated, tasting the words like something bitter. "Is that what you call it when you try to convince someone they're losing their mind?" When you make decisions about their money without consulting them? When you treat their home like a place you have automatic access to? The rain was coming down harder now, turning the driveway into a shallow lake that reflected the gray sky and our distorted figures. My daughter-in-law pulled her coat tighter and shot my son a look that said this conversation was taking longer than they'd planned. "We're trying to help you," she said, her voice rising above the sound of water hitting pavement. "We're trying to protect you from making mistakes that could hurt you financially. But if you're going to be stubborn about it, if you're going to spread stories around the neighborhood, then what?" I asked, and something in my tone made them both go still. "You'll what? Take away my keys?" "Oh, wait, you can't anymore, can you? Because I changed the locks." The silence that followed was filled only with the sound of rain and the distant hum of traffic on the main road. My son's mouth opened and closed like he was trying to find words for something he hadn't expected to have to argue about. "You changed the locks," he said finally, his voice flat with disbelief. "I did. It's my house. They're my locks to change. But what if there's an emergency? What if you fall, or have a medical crisis, or—" "Then I'll call 911, like any other competent adult," I said. "Or I'll call Mrs. Rodriguez, who has proven herself to be a much more reliable neighbor than I gave her credit for." I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the rain. "What stories would those be?" "About us trying to control your finances," my daughter-in-law said, her voice sharp with the kind of impatience that comes when someone refuses to accept the role you've written for them. "About us questioning your competence. Mrs. Rodriguez is worried about you, Mom. She thinks you might be getting confused about what's really happening." The rain picked up, soaking through my gardening clothes, but I didn't move toward the shelter of my porch. Something in their certainty, in the way they'd turned my neighbor's kindness into evidence of my decline, made me want to stand exactly where I was, rooted like the marigolds I'd been watering. "What's really happening," I said, my voice steady despite the rain running down my face, "is that you've been managing my life without my permission. What's really happening is that you discuss my mental state at family dinners as if I'm not sitting right there. What's really happening is that you asked me not to tell the neighbors about our disagreement because you know how it would sound to people who aren't invested in believing I'm incompetent." My son's face flushed, and he stepped closer, his voice dropping to that same urgent whisper he'd used at my kitchen window. "You're embarrassing yourself, Mom. And you're embarrassing us. Mrs. Rodriguez doesn't need to hear about our private family business." "Our private family business," I repeated, tasting the words like something bitter. "Is that what you call it when you try to convince someone they're losing their mind? When you make decisions about their money without consulting them? When you treat their home like a place you have automatic access to?" The rain was coming down harder now, turning the driveway into a shallow lake that reflected the gray sky and our distorted figures. My daughter-in-law pulled her coat tighter and shot my son a look that said this conversation was taking longer than they'd planned. "We're trying to help you," she said, her voice rising above the sound of water hitting pavement. "We're trying to protect you from making mistakes that could hurt you financially. But if you're going to be stubborn about it, if you're going to spread stories around the neighborhood, then what?" I asked, and something in my tone made them both go still. "You'll what? Take away my keys?" "Oh, wait, you can't anymore, can you? Because I changed the locks." The silence that followed was filled only with the sound of rain and the distant hum of traffic on the main road. My son's mouth opened and closed like he was trying to find words for something he hadn't expected to have to argue about. "You changed the locks," he said finally, his voice flat with disbelief. "I did. It's my house. They're my locks to change. But what if there's an emergency? What if you fall, or have a medical crisis, or—" "Then I'll call 911, like any other competent adult," I said. "Or I'll call Mrs. Rodriguez, who has proven herself to be a much more reliable neighbor than I gave her credit for." My daughter-in-law made a sound of frustration, a sharp exhale that spoke of patience finally exhausted. This is exactly what we're talking about, Mom. This paranoid thinking, this hostility toward people who are just trying to help. It's not normal. I looked at her standing there in her expensive coat, rain dripping from her carefully styled hair, and felt something settle in my chest like a key finding its proper lock. My calm is not your victory, I thought, and the clarity of that understanding was almost startling. You're right, I said quietly. It's not normal. It's not normal to have to change your locks to feel safe in your own home. It's not normal to have to hide your competence to avoid being managed. It's not normal to whisper commands through kitchen windows about what your mother is and isn't allowed to say to her own neighbors. The rain continued to fall, washing the driveway clean, carrying away the dust and debris that had accumulated over the long, dry summer. I stood there getting soaked, feeling more present in my own body than I had in months, watching my son and daughter-in-law realize that the conversation they'd planned wasn't the conversation they were having. We're done here, my daughter-in-law said finally, turning toward her car. When you're ready to have a rational discussion about your future, you know how to reach us. My son lingered for a moment, his face cycling through expressions I couldn't quite read, frustration, disappointment, and something that might have been grief. Mom, he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. We love you. We're worried about you. Can't you see that? I looked at him standing there in the rain, this man I'd raised, this person whose diapers I'd changed and whose scraped knees I'd bandaged and whose homework I'd helped with for 12 long years. I loved him too, desperately and completely, which was exactly why this conversation was so necessary. I can see that you love me, I said. But love without respect isn't protection, it's control. And I'm too old and too tired to pretend I can't tell the difference anymore. He stood there for another moment, water dripping from his coat, then turned and walked to his car without another word. I watched them drive away, their taillights disappearing into the gray afternoon, and felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite sadness but was definitely, unmistakably, freedom. I was still standing in the driveway when Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at my side with a large umbrella, her presence as quiet and steady as always. Rough conversation? She asked, holding the umbrella over both of us. Necessary conversation, I corrected, and we stood there together watching the rain wash my driveway clean. 2 days later, a folded piece of paper appeared under my windshield wiper, tucked there so carefully I almost missed it. The handwriting was young and careful, the kind of script that still showed the influence of elementary school penmanship lessons. I unfolded it standing in my garage, reading by the light of the single bulb that hung from the ceiling. Grandma, it began, Mom and Dad told me about your fight. They said you were being difficult and that you changed your locks because you don't trust family anymore. But I remember what you told me about the difference between being heard and being managed, and I think maybe you're just trying to be heard. I had to stop reading for a moment, my throat tight with something that felt like gratitude and grief mixed. When had I told her that? I couldn't remember the specific conversation, but I could picture her sitting at my kitchen table, probably helping me with some small task while her parents discussed my declining capabilities in the next room. I wanted you to know that I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, the note continued. And I wanted you to know that I don't think you're confused or difficult. I think you're brave. I hope when I'm your age, I'm brave enough to change my own locks when I need to. The note was signed with a small heart and her name written in the careful cursive she'd been practicing since 3rd grade. I folded it carefully and slipped it into my pocket, feeling the weight of it like a talisman against all the voices that had been telling me I was wrong to trust my own judgment. That afternoon, I called her and asked if she'd like to meet me at the park for ice cream. Her mother answered the phone, her voice cool and formal, but she put my granddaughter on without comment. We arranged to meet at the bench under the lilac trees, the one where we'd sat so many times before when she was smaller and the world felt less complicated. She was waiting for me when I arrived, her long legs folded under her on the wooden bench, a book open in her lap. At 15, she was caught between childhood and something else, her face still soft with youth but her eyes already showing the particular awareness that comes from watching adults navigate their complicated relationships. Thank you for the note, I said, settling beside her on the bench. The lilac blooms were past their peak but still fragrant, their purple clusters beginning to brown at the edges. It meant more to me than you probably realize. She closed her book and looked at me with the kind of directness that teenagers specialize in, the ability to cut through adult politeness and get straight to the heart of things. Are you okay, Grandma? Really okay? I considered the question seriously, watching a squirrel navigate the branches above us, its movements quick and purposeful. I'm better than I've been in a long time, I said finally. I'm remembering what it feels like to trust my own judgment. Mom says you're being stubborn. I probably am. Sometimes stubbornness and self-respect look very similar from the outside. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the afternoon light filter through the lilac leaves, listening to the distant sounds of children playing on the swings. My granddaughter had inherited my love of quiet moments, the ability to be present without needing to fill every silence with words. Can I tell you something? She said eventually, her voice careful in a way that suggested she'd been thinking about this conversation for a while. Always. I've been watching how they talk to you at family dinners. Mom and Dad. And I've been thinking about how they talk about you when you're not there. She picked at a loose thread on her jeans, not meeting my eyes. It makes me uncomfortable. Like, they love you, I know they do. But they talk about you like you're a problem to be solved instead of a person to be listened to. The honesty in her voice and the careful way she was trying to articulate something she didn't quite have words for yet made my chest tight with pride and sadness. Support sometimes arrives folded small, I thought, remembering her note tucked under my windshield wiper. That's a very grown-up observation, I said. And unfortunately, a very accurate one. Is that why you changed the locks? Because you needed them to listen instead of manage? I looked at her sitting there in the dappled shade, this young woman who was learning to see the world clearly, to trust her own perceptions even when they contradicted the adults around her. That's exactly why, I said. Sometimes you have to change the locks on your life to remind people that you're the one who gets to decide who comes in. We talked for another hour, sharing stories and observations, trading the kind of honest conversation that had become rare in our family gatherings. She told me about school, about her friends, and about the college applications she was starting to think about. I told her about Mrs. Rodriguez, about the list I'd written, and about the strange freedom that comes from finally saying no to things you should never have said yes to in the first place. When it was time to go, she hugged me with the fierce intensity of someone who had been waiting a long time to offer comfort. I'm proud of you, Grandma, she whispered against my shoulder. And I'm going to keep visiting, no matter what Mom and Dad say about it. I drove home with her words echoing in my mind, feeling lighter than I had in months. The afternoon sun slanted through my windshield, warming my face, and I found myself humming an old song I hadn't thought of in years. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed that Mrs. Rodriguez had left a small pot of marigolds by my front door, their bright orange faces turned toward the light like tiny suns. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a different kind of list, not the things I no longer owed, but the things I wanted to reclaim. At the top of the page, I wrote, "My name is on my own decisions." Below that, my voice in my own story. And below that, my signature on my own life. The next morning, I drove to the bank with a manila folder full of documents and a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The same young teller who had helped me before greeted me by name, her smile genuine and professional. I explained what I needed, copies of everything, a clear picture of my financial situation, and information about setting up a small trust fund. Of course, Mrs. Chen, she said, pulling up my accounts on her computer. These are all very straightforward requests. Your accounts are in excellent order, by the way. Very well managed. I spent the next 2 hours organizing papers, signing forms, and making decisions about my own money with the kind of calm authority I'd forgotten I possessed. The trust fund was modest, just enough to make a small difference in something I cared about, but the act of setting it up felt monumental. Paper can be armor, I thought, watching the teller process my requests with efficient kindness. When I got home, I spread all the documents across my kitchen table, organizing them into neat stacks, filing them in a new binder I'd bought specifically for this purpose. Each page represented a piece of my life that I was taking back, a decision that was mine to make, and a signature that belonged to me alone. The binder was thick and substantial, its navy blue cover embossed with my name in gold letters. I ran my fingers over those letters, my name, my documents, my choices, and felt something settle in my chest that had been restless for months. This was what competence looked like, not the absence of questions, but the presence of answers. Not the elimination of uncertainty, but the confidence to navigate it. I placed the binder on the shelf next to my other important documents, between the deed to my house and my insurance policies. It belonged there, this record of my reclaimed agency, this proof that I was still the author of my own story. That afternoon, I called the Community Garden Association and asked about donating. The woman who answered the phone was delighted to hear from me, explaining that they were always in need of funds for new plantings, tools, and educational programs. We have a donor recognition program, she said. Contributors can sponsor specific garden beds or memorial plantings. Would you be interested in something like that? I'd like to sponsor a bed of marigolds, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. Something bright and resilient. Something that comes back year after year. Marigolds are perfect, she said. They're hardy and beautiful, and they actually help protect other plants from pests. Very practical flowers. We arranged for me to visit the garden the following week to choose the location and sign the paperwork. As I hung up the phone, I realized I was smiling, not the careful, accommodating smile I'd worn for so many months, but something genuine and unguarded. The morning of my visit to the community garden dawned clear and bright, the kind of September day that feels like a gift after a long, humid summer. I dressed carefully, not formally, but with the kind of attention to detail that comes from knowing you're about to do something important. I chose my good shoes, the ones that were comfortable enough for walking but nice enough to show respect for the occasion. The garden was larger than I'd expected, sprawling across several acres of what had once been an empty lot. Raised beds lined neat pathways, each one bursting with late-season vegetables and flowers. The air smelled of earth and growing things, of tomatoes ripening in the sun and herbs releasing their fragrance into the warm morning. The garden coordinator, a woman about my daughter-in-law's age with soil under her fingernails and laugh lines around her eyes, met me at the entrance. Mrs. Chen? I'm Sarah. Thank you so much for your donation. Let me show you around. We walked the pathways together, Sarah pointing out different sections and explaining the garden's history and mission. Families worked in their assigned plots, children helped to harvest vegetables, and elderly volunteers taught younger gardeners about companion planting and soil preparation. It was a place where knowledge flowed in all directions, where experience was valued regardless of the age of the person offering it. Here's where we thought your marigold bed could go, Sarah said, stopping beside a sunny corner plot near the garden's main entrance. It would be one of the first things people see when they visit, and marigolds are wonderful companion plants for the vegetable beds nearby. I knelt and picked up a handful of the dark, rich soil, feeling its texture between my fingers. It was good earth, well tended and fertile, the kind of ground where things could take root and flourish. This is perfect, I said, and meant it. The paperwork was simple, a donation form, a small plaque order with my name and the date, and a receipt for my records. But as I signed my name at the bottom of the form, I felt the weight of the moment. My name blooms in bright petals, I thought, imagining the marigolds that would grow here, the small splash of orange and gold that would carry my signature into the world. Would you like to plant the first seeds yourself? Sarah asked. We have some marigold starts in the greenhouse that are ready to transplant. I followed her to a small greenhouse at the back of the garden, where rows of seedlings waited in their plastic pots. The marigold starts were sturdy and green, their first buds just beginning to show hints of the bright flowers they would become. I chose 6 plants, Their roots were healthy and white when Sarah gently removed them from their containers. Back at my sponsored bed, I knelt in the soil and began to dig. The earth was soft and welcoming, easy to work with my hands. I planted each seedling carefully, spacing them evenly, pressing the soil gently around their roots. The sun was warm on my back, and I could hear the quiet conversations of other gardeners, the distant laughter of children, and the peaceful sounds of a community at work. When I finished planting, I sat back on my heels and looked at what I'd created. 6 small plants in a neat row, their bright green leaves already turning toward the sun. They looked vulnerable and determined at the same time, these flowers that would grow and bloom and seed themselves for years to come. "They'll be beautiful," Sarah said, standing beside me. "Marigolds are such reliable flowers. Once they're established, they pretty much take care of themselves." I brushed the soil from my hands and stood, feeling the satisfying ache of work well done. "That's exactly what I was hoping for," I said. "Something that doesn't need constant management to thrive." That evening, I sat on my front porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun set behind my maple tree. The evening air carried the scent of Mrs. Rodriguez's jasmine and the distant sound of children being called in for dinner. My hands still smelled faintly of earth from the morning's planting, and I found myself looking forward to the day when I could drive back to the garden and see those marigolds in full bloom, their bright faces turned toward the sun like small declarations of independence. I was still sitting there when my son's car pulled into the driveway. This time, he came alone, walking slowly up the path with his hands in his pockets, his shoulders carrying the weight of someone who had been thinking hard about difficult things. I didn't get up from my chair, but I didn't tense either. Whatever conversation we were about to have, I would meet it from this place of quiet certainty I'd been building, one small decision at a time. "Mom," he said, stopping at the bottom of my porch steps. "Can we talk?" "Of course." I gestured to the empty chair beside me. "Would you like some tea?" He climbed the steps and settled into the chair, but shook his head at the offer of tea. We sat in silence for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky, listening to the evening sounds of our neighborhood settling into the night. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, finally. "About love and respect. About the difference between protection and control." He paused, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I remembered from his childhood, when he was working through a problem that didn't have easy answers. "I think maybe I've been so worried about losing you that I forgot to listen to you." I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. "I'm not going anywhere," I said quietly. "But I need to be here as myself, not as someone else's idea of who I should be." "I know. I think I know that now." He leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on his knees, his voice careful and honest. "When you changed the locks, when you started talking to Mrs. Rodriguez about our family business, it scared me. Not because you were doing anything wrong, but because it meant you weren't going to let me manage things anymore. And I'd gotten used to managing things." The honesty in his admission surprised me. I'd expected defensiveness, justification, maybe even anger. But this quiet acknowledgement of his own need for control felt like the beginning of something different between us. "Managing things isn't the same as caring for people," I said. "And being cared for isn't the same as being diminished. I'm starting to understand that." He was quiet for a moment, then looked at me directly. "I want to try again. Differently this time. But I need you to tell me what that looks like, because clearly I don't know." I considered his question, watching a neighbor walk their dog past our house, the small rituals of evening playing out around us. What did I want from my relationship with my son? What would respect look like in practice, not just in theory? "I want you to ask before you assume," I said finally. "I want you to trust my judgment until I give you a specific reason not to. I want you to remember that I raised you successfully for 18 years, which suggests I might still be capable of making reasonable decisions about my own life." He nodded slowly. "That's fair. More than fair. And I want you to understand that having boundaries doesn't mean I love you less. It means I love myself enough to insist on being treated with dignity. The locks, he said, and there was something almost rueful in his voice. You really did need to change the locks. I really did. And I need you to be okay with that, because they're staying changed. We sat together as full darkness settled over the neighborhood, the porch light casting a warm circle around us. It wasn't a complete resolution. There would be more conversations, more negotiations, and more moments when we'd have to choose respect over convenience. But it was a beginning, this quiet acknowledgement that love could coexist with boundaries, that caring for someone didn't require controlling them. There's something else, he said as he prepared to leave. Your granddaughter wants to visit you this weekend. She asked me specifically to tell you that she'd like to help you with some project you mentioned. I smiled, thinking of the marigold bed that would need tending, the small rituals of care that could be shared without diminishment. Tell her I'd love the company. And tell her to bring her gardening gloves. After he left, I sat on my porch for a while longer, feeling the weight of the day settling around me like a comfortable blanket. The conversation hadn't solved everything. Relationships don't heal in single conversations, no matter how honest they are. But it had opened a door that had been closed for too long and created space for something different to grow between us. I thought about the marigolds I'd planted that morning, their roots already beginning to spread in the dark soil, their faces turned toward tomorrow's sun. They would bloom soon, bright and resilient, requiring nothing more than basic care and the freedom to grow according to their own nature. It seemed like a good metaphor for the life I was reclaiming, one small decision at a time. The next morning, Mrs. Rodriguez brought a loaf of fresh bread and an invitation to join her for coffee. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd written my list of refusals, where I'd planned my small revolution. But now it felt different, not like a battleground, but like a place where good conversations could happen, where friendship could be nurtured over shared meals and honest words. You look peaceful, Mrs. Rodriguez observed, breaking off a piece of bread and spreading it with the honey I'd set out. Like someone who's made her peace with difficult decisions. I think I have, I said, savoring the warm bread, the simple pleasure of sharing food with a friend. It's strange how much energy it takes to fight for the right to be yourself. But it's stranger how much energy you get back once you stop apologizing for taking up space. We talked about gardens and grandchildren, about the small victories that accumulate into larger changes, and about the particular satisfaction that comes from planting something that will outlast the person who planted it. Mrs. Rodriguez told me about her own struggles with her daughter and the careful negotiations required to maintain independence while accepting appropriate help. It's a dance, she said, this business of aging with dignity. You have to keep moving, keep adjusting, and keep insisting on your right to lead sometimes instead of always following. When she left, I cleaned up our breakfast dishes and prepared for my granddaughter's visit. She arrived that afternoon with gardening gloves and a thermos of lemonade, her face bright with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from having a project to share with someone you love. Tell me about these marigolds, she said as we drove to the community garden. Grandpa always said you had the best flower garden in the neighborhood, but I don't remember you gardening much lately. I stopped for a while, I admitted. I think I forgot that I was allowed to plant things that were just for beauty, just for the pleasure of watching them grow. In the garden, we knelt together in the soil, checking on the seedlings I'd planted, pulling a few small weeds that had sprouted overnight. My granddaughter worked with the kind of focused attention that reminded me of myself at her age, when the world still felt full of possibilities and every small task could be approached with complete presence. They're going to be beautiful, she said, gently watering the plants with a small watering can Sarah had provided. I love that they'll have your name on them. Like a little piece of you that will keep blooming even when you're not here to see it. The matter-of-fact way she mentioned my eventual absence didn't sting the way it might have a few months ago. Instead, it felt like recognition. She saw me as someone whose legacy would be measured not in how well I'd been managed, but in what I'd chosen to plant and nurture and leave behind. We worked in comfortable silence, tending not just the marigolds but the other plants nearby, pulling weeds and deadheading spent flowers with the kind of meditative attention that gardening requires. Other volunteers worked around us, and I found myself part of a community I hadn't known existed, connected to people through the simple act of caring for growing things. "Grandma," my granddaughter said as we prepared to leave, "I'm proud of you for doing this. For all of it, the locks, the garden, and standing up to Mom and Dad. I know it wasn't easy." I looked at her standing there in the afternoon light, soil under her fingernails, her face serious with the weight of what she was trying to say. "Thank you," I said. "That means more to me than you know. I hope when I'm your age, I'm brave enough to plant my own marigolds." "You will be," I said with complete certainty. "You already are." That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my checkbook and a stack of bills, managing my own finances with the kind of calm competence I'd been told I no longer possessed. The numbers added up correctly, the accounts balanced, and the decisions were mine to make. It was ordinary work, the kind of mundane responsibility that most adults take for granted. But for me, in that moment, it felt like a quiet victory. I thought about the whisper that had started all of this, my son's urgent command pressed against my kitchen window like a secret he needed me to keep. "Don't tell the neighbors." But I had told them, and the world hadn't ended. Instead, it had expanded, making room for friendship and honesty and the particular relief that comes from finally telling the truth about your own life. The bread I'd baked that morning, the loaves that hadn't burned, that had risen properly and filled my kitchen with the scent of home, sat cooling on the counter. Tomorrow I would share it with Mrs. Rodriguez, maybe invite her to see the marigold bed, and continue the slow work of building a life that belonged entirely to me. I finished paying my bills and filed the receipts in my navy blue binder, each document a small proof of my continued competence. Then I made myself a cup of tea in my good china and sat by my kitchen window, looking out at the neighborhood where I'd lived for 37 years, where I'd planned to live for as many more as I was given. The window where my son had pressed his face and whispered his demand for my silence now framed a different view, not a place where secrets had to be kept, but a community where truth could be spoken gently and still carry weight. The porch light burned steady and bright, welcoming anyone who chose to approach with respect rather than management, with curiosity rather than control. I raised my teacup in a small toast to the woman I'd been becoming, one small decision at a time. The whisper no longer decides my voice, I thought, and the truth of that settled around me like a coat that finally fit properly, like a key that turned smoothly in a lock I'd chosen for myself. Outside my window, Mrs. Rodriguez's porch light answered mine, two steady beacons in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow there would be more conversations, more small acts of tending and growing, and more opportunities to practice the quiet art of living with dignity. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in my own home, at my own table, drinking tea from my own good china, surrounded by the peaceful silence of a life reclaimed. The marigolds would bloom soon, bright and resilient in their sunny corner of the community garden. And I would be there to see them, to tend them, to watch them seed themselves for seasons I might not live to see but could trust to unfold according to their own nature. It seemed like enough, more than enough. It seemed like everything.